show you an example of a group of saved people who began walking after the Spirit. They could not lose their salvation, sealed and saved saints. And then they began walking after the flesh. These folks were saved, but they reverted to a walking after the flesh position. Not a position in Christ, they couldn't lose that, but to a walking after the flesh idea in their thinking. They understood up front what Christ's cross work had accomplished where their sins were concerned. Paul had made that abundantly clear. They accepted it. They began after the Spirit, Paul said. Having been taught by Paul, they had begun in belief. But then some false teachers came along. And these saved people, saved and sealed saints, became confused in their thinking. You know who I'm talking about here, don't you? Who am I thinking of? Sure, the foolish Galatians. You foolish Galatians. Let's review that passage. Galatians chapter 3, beginning with verse 1. O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you, that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ hath been evidently set forth, crucified among you. They knew about the crucifixion. They knew about the resurrection. They knew what it accomplished. Paul made that clear to them. They were saved and sealed saints. This only what I learn of you, in light of what? In light of their reversion back to a walking after the flesh attitude. Received ye the Spirit by the works of the law, or by the hearing of faith? How did you get the Spirit in the first place? Are you so foolish? Having begun in the Spirit, are you now made perfect, perfecting yourself by your fleshly performance? Having begun in the Spirit, are you now made perfect by the flesh? Impossible is the idea here. The problem with the foolish Galatians was not the fact that they were slipping back into a sinful lifestyle. The problem with the foolish Galatians was incorrect thinking. They were slipping back away from the reality of grace and back into a works for righteousness, to maintain a righteous standing with God concept. They'd been foolishly duped, and they had reverted in their thinking to what Paul describes as walking after the flesh. These folks needed to be straightened out. They needed the correction there for that thinking, and Paul delivered that in 2 Timothy 3:16. And he talks about that. But Paul provided that correction by asking these folks if they knew the source from which their spiritual life had been derived. Did it come from first believing or from later doing? That's the issue. Are you so foolish? Having begun in the Spirit, are you now made perfect by the flesh? He asked them. That's why Paul could issue this pointed admonition we see in Galatians chapter 5, verse 25. If we live in the Spirit, if that's the source of our spiritual life, the Spirit joining us to Christ and becoming a part of us, if that's the source of our spiritual life, let us also walk in the Spirit, meaning let us remain in our minds with that concept and not move away from that in our thinking. Paul's saying, don't let your thinking become foolish thinking and go back to dealing with God according to rules and regulations. You do not want God to deal with you legalistically. He won't for a believer, but you want him to deal with you graciously. Let's not do the things we do with a misguided thinking that we are gaining spiritual life from the things that we do. Let us recognize where our spiritual life comes from, and let us give the entire credit where that credit is due, Paul's saying. The Galatians were certainly living or deriving their life from the Spirit. Paul knew that. They'd begun there. Their fleshly performance was not the source of their spiritual life, and they needed to be reminded of that. I think most saints need to be reminded of that over and over, because where does the natural mind take us? Right back to the thinking that, God's looking at the do's and the don'ts here, and we better have more do's than we have don'ts, or we're in trouble with God. Well, the law was never successful at making anyone good before God. It wasn't given for that purpose, as we've explained fully Paul has in the chapters previous. Likewise, the law would never be successful in helping a person maintain a goodness before God. Law-keeping hadn't accomplished goodness before God for those folks in the first place. Romans 8:3, for what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, God sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin, condemned sin in the flesh. God condemned sin where? In the flesh. In whose flesh? According to Paul, in Christ's flesh, which takes us right back to that no condemnation sitting in verse 1 of chapter 8. Moving quickly ahead now to verse 4.